There is a place on this earth where some of the most educated, most fearless, most technologically equipped scientists in human history walked up to a door and turned around. Not because they lacked the tools, not because they lacked the funding, not because they lacked the courage. They turned around because something on the other side of that sealed wall made them realize that opening it would be one of the most irreversible mistakes in recorded human history. And so they sealed it back. They covered their instruments. They filed their reports. And then, in carefully chosen academic language, they told the world what they had found without telling the world what they were truly afraid of. That is the story we are about to walk through. A story of a 3,000-year-old tomb in China, a decision so controversial it is still debated in the halls of archaeology departments worldwide, a chamber filled with things so dangerous, so rare, and so fragile that modern science itself does not yet know how to protect them. This is not a story about the past. This is a story about what the past is still capable of doing to us. Let's talk about what the world knows. And then, let's talk about what the world is not being told. Somewhere beneath the dry, unassuming terrain of Shanxi province in central China, beneath a man-made hill that looks almost embarrassingly ordinary from a distance, lies what many serious scholars now believe to be the single most complex and most dangerous archaeological site ever discovered on the surface of this planet. We are not talking about a tomb in the way most people understand tombs. We are not talking about a room. We are not talking about a burial pit or a ceremonial grave or a chamber with a sarcophagus and some painted walls. We are talking about an entirely engineered underground civilization, a complete, self-contained world built beneath the earth at a scale that still does not fully make sense to the people studying it, even today in 2025, with all the technology available to them. The man buried inside is Qin Shi Huang, and before you skip past that name like it belongs in a history textbook, understand this: you live in a world that this man fundamentally shaped. The name China itself comes from him. The concept of a unified Chinese state, which has given the modern world its most populous nation, its second largest economy, and one of its most consequential geopolitical powers, begins with this one individual. He was not just a king, he was not just an emperor, he was the architect of the very idea of China, and he did it through a combination of genius, paranoia, obsession, and a brutality so systematic it made the people around him genuinely believe he was not entirely human. He unified 7 warring kingdoms into one empire. He standardized currency, written language, and measurements across a civilization of millions. He built the foundational sections of what would become the Great Wall. And then, while simultaneously ruling the most powerful empire on Earth, he spent 38 years building himself a tomb. Think about that number. 38 years. He began construction while he was still alive before the age of 30. He was so certain of his own power that he started preparing for his death before he was even certain he would die. And what he built was not a tomb. It was a statement. It was a declaration made in stone and earth and mercury and in blood that even death itself would operate on his terms. The mausoleum complex covers approximately 56 square kilometers of land. That is a number that requires a moment of pause. The total area is more than 70 times the size of the Forbidden City. This is not a burial site. This is a buried empire. And at its center, sealed beneath layers of compacted earth, rammed clay, charcoal, and stone, lies the inner burial chamber, the one room that no archaeologist has ever entered. The one room that every scanner, every radar pulse, every seismic measurement, and every academic paper has circled around without ever touching. The room that, in the year 2025, remains sealed, unknown, and entirely intact, exactly as it was when it was closed more than 2,200 years ago. And this is where the story stops being history and starts being something else entirely. Because the question is not what is inside. The question, the real question, the question that scientists are very carefully not answering in public, is what happens to the inside the moment we open it. To understand why that question is so terrifying, you have to go back to 1974. You have to go to a group of farmers in Lintong district, Shanxi province, who were digging a well during a drought. They were doing what people do when the land is dry. They were going deeper, looking for water. What they found instead was the edge of an arm, a clay arm, a life-sized clay arm attached to a life-sized clay soldier. And as they dug further, and as word spread, and as archaeologists arrived and began to excavate, what emerged from that ground was something that stopped the entire global archaeological community in its tracks. The Terracotta Army, more than 8,000 life-sized warriors, horses, and chariots, each with unique facial features, arranged in military formation beneath the earth, guarding a perimeter around the central tomb that they had been guarding, in silent, buried darkness for over 2 millennia. The discovery was not just significant, it was genuinely shocking. Not because of the scale, though the scale was overwhelming. It was shocking because of what the army revealed about the level of engineering, the level of planning, and the level of sheer organizational power that had gone into building this complex. Each warrior was individually crafted. Each face was distinct. The weapons they carried, real bronze spears, real crossbows, real swords, were still sharp when excavated. The alloy used to preserve those blades had been engineered specifically to prevent oxidation, and that engineering had worked for over 2,000 years better than most modern steel treatments managed to work for 2 decades. This was not primitive. This was mastery. And if the outer defensive perimeter was built at this level, what had been done to the inner sanctum? But here is where it gets worse. Because when those terracotta warriors were first pulled from the earth in the 1970s, something happened that no one could fully stop. The vibrant pigments that had coated their armor flaked off within minutes of exposure to air. Within minutes. Colors that had survived underground for 2,000 years. Blues, reds, greens, the vivid warrior paint of the Qin dynasty, simply dissolved on contact with oxygen, with humidity, with the outside world. Archaeologists watched, helpless, as the surface of history evaporated in front of their eyes. It was one of the most heartbreaking moments in modern archaeology, and they could not stop it. They did not have the technology to stop it. And if that happened to the outer army, the outer defensive perimeter, the outermost layer of this complex, if that is what open air did to the edge of Qin Shi Huang's burial world, then what would open air do to the center of it? The answer, according to every serious scientific assessment conducted on this site, is catastrophic and irreversible. Inside the central burial chamber, if ancient accounts and modern measurements are to be believed, there are lacquered coffins, silk banners, painted sculptures, documents, weapons, tapestries, and other organic materials that have been sealed in a controlled, oxygen-free microenvironment for over 2,000 years. The moment that environment is broken, the moment a drill bit punches through that final layer of rammed earth and the air equalizes, the atmospheric shock alone would begin destroying things that no museum, no laboratory, no conservation team on Earth currently has the capability to stop fast enough. We are talking about a situation where, by the time you have set up your preservation equipment, history has already started dying. This is why the decision was made to seal it again, not because of superstition, not because of politics, though politics certainly plays a role, but because of a cold, rational, scientific calculation. The cost of opening this tomb right now, with current technology, is greater than the cost of waiting. But wait. And this is the part that mainstream coverage consistently glosses over. What exactly does waiting mean? What have scientists actually been doing during this wait? Because it is not nothing. Far from it. What has been happening at this site over the last several decades is a quiet, methodical, extraordinarily sophisticated operation of remote investigation. And some of what that investigation has revealed is deeply, genuinely unsettling. Using integrated geophysical methods, including high-precision gravity surveys, magnetic surveys, electrical resistivity tomography, radioactive radon measurements, and ground-penetrating radar, research teams have been probing the interior of the burial mound without ever physically entering it. And what the data has given back to them is a picture. Blurry, incomplete, but terrifyingly suggestive of what lies beneath. Ground-penetrating radar reveals large cavities and structural elements that suggest a multi-level chamber. Multi-level, not a room, a structure with levels. An underground architecture with floors. The buried palace, described in ancient texts, is not metaphor. It is architecture. It is real. It is down there. And then there is the Mercury. This is the part of the story that transforms academic archaeology into something that feels genuinely dangerous. Ancient accounts suggest that mercury was used to simulate the Yangtze River, the Yellow River, and even the Great Seas, creating an intricate and highly toxic liquid environment within the tomb. For generations, historians filed this description under poetic exaggeration. The ancient historian Sima Qian, writing approximately 100 years after the emperor's death, described rivers of flowing liquid mercury designed to replicate China's great waterways. It sounded like the kind of thing ancient writers invented to make dead kings seem more powerful. It sounded like mythology. Then the soil test came back. A study published in 2020 detected unusually high levels of mercury in the soil around the burial mound, reinforcing the theory that vast mercury rivers may indeed lie hidden inside. The mercury levels in the earth immediately surrounding the central tomb are measurably, significantly, scientifically confirmed to be higher than they should naturally be. There is no geological explanation for this concentration. There is no industrial contamination theory that satisfactorily accounts for it. The mercury is there because the mercury was put there, which means the rivers of liquid mercury described by Sima Qian 2,000 years ago are almost certainly real, which means that somewhere beneath that unassuming hill in Shanxi, there are actual rivers of liquid mercury, sealed in the dark, flowing through channels, maintaining an environment that was engineered specifically to be lethal to intruders. Read that again. Liquid mercury, rivers, engineered, still there, still liquid, still lethal. And the mercury is not just a physical hazard. It changes the entire conservation calculus. Because mercury vapor is toxic, highly volatile, and pervasive. The moment that chamber is opened, the mercury would begin to vaporize. Any archaeologist in the vicinity without full hazmat containment would be at serious risk. Any artifact in the immediate vicinity of those mercury channels, any silk, any wood, any painted surface, any organic material, would be exposed to mercury contamination that would alter their chemical composition irreversibly. The contamination protocols alone, before a single artifact could be safely touched, would require a level of infrastructure currently not deployed at any archaeological site in the world. But it does not stop there, because the mercury is not the only defense this tomb appears to have been given. Sima Qian documented the potential existence of traps within the tomb. Craftsmen were directed to fashion crossbows and arrows designed to engage intruders, while also employing mercury to imitate the coursing of several rivers, such as the Yangtze and Yellow River within the tomb. Automatic crossbow mechanisms, spring-loaded weapons designed to fire at the moment of entry. Now, at this point, you might be thinking, crossbows from 2,000 years ago could not possibly still function. And you might be right. The mechanisms would likely have degraded over time. But here is what makes that comfort slightly more fragile than it sounds. The bronze weapons found in the outer sections of this complex, the actual battlefield-grade weapons carried by the terracotta warriors, were not corroded. They were sharp. The metallurgical engineering applied to this complex was so advanced that the weapons buried alongside the outer army had survived 2 millennia in near-perfect condition. If the outer weapons survived, what does that tell you about the inner ones? The ones placed specifically to protect the emperor's body, built by the same craftsmen, using the same or better technology, in a sealed environment with no oxidation. This is not a thought experiment. This is a genuine engineering question that archaeologists and material scientists are actively wrestling with, because they need to know what they are walking into before they walk into it. And all of this is before we get to the political dimension, because the tomb of Qin Shi Huang is not just an archaeological site. It is a symbol. It is a symbol of Chinese civilization at its most foundational, most powerful, most unapologetically ambitious moment. The Chinese government's relationship with this site is not simply that of a state managing a heritage location. The do-no-harm approach has become official policy in China and standard practice internationally. That sounds like responsible stewardship, and in many ways it is. But it also means that access to the site, decisions about investigation, and choices about if and when the central chamber is ever opened are not purely scientific decisions. They are political ones. They are decisions that carry symbolic weight about Chinese sovereignty over its own history, about who gets to claim ownership of one of the oldest and most powerful civilizations that ever existed, and about what story the Chinese state chooses to tell about its origins. The debate is not simply between archaeologists who want to open the tomb and archaeologists who do not. The debate is no longer, what marvels could we reveal, but rather, what can we reveal while ensuring it survives for centuries afterward? And wrapped around that scientific debate is a political one. Who decides? Who gets to be in the room? Which nation's scientists lead the investigation? Which countries' conservation protocols take precedence? Which government's interests define what counts as preserving history versus exploiting it? These are not small questions. They are questions that touch on the same tensions that define the geopolitical landscape of the 21st century Chinese power, Western academic institutions, international heritage law, and the fundamental question of who owns the ancient world. The man himself, Qin Shi Huang, is a figure so complex that the debate over his legacy mirrors the debate over his tomb. He was, without question, one of the most consequential human beings who ever lived. He unified a continent-sized civilization. He created administrative systems, legal codes, and infrastructure projects that outlasted his dynasty by centuries. He is the reason there is a China at all in the form we recognize it today. But the cost at which he achieved these things was almost incomprehensible. Ancient Chinese historians like Sima Qian describe the tomb as a vast underground palace with rivers of mercury flowing mechanically through channels, and claim the entire construction required the labor of around 700,000 workers, 700,000 people. And the workers who built the innermost chamber, according to historical accounts, were sealed inside it when it was closed, so that they could never reveal its secrets. The emperor who built a civilization by unifying the living built his afterlife by entombing the dead. He was also, according to the historical record, a man consumed by terror, not of his enemies, not of other kings. He was terrified of death itself. Historical reports suggest he became obsessed with drinking mercury in a misguided quest for eternal life, and he often drank wine laced with mercury, possibly dying of mercury poisoning at the age of 49. The man who filled his tomb with rivers of mercury to guarantee his immortal empire was likely killed by his own obsession with the substance. The man who built the most elaborate death-proof monument in human history died prematurely, poisoned by his own hand before he was 50 years old. There is something in that irony that feels almost too perfectly constructed to be real. But it is real, and it tells you something essential about what drives human beings to build impossible things. Not confidence, but fear. Not power, but the terror of losing power. Not certainty, but the desperate, consuming need to impose certainty on an existence that refuses to offer it. And here is what that irony does to the stakes of this story. Because the tomb was not just built to protect him. It was built to prove something. It was built to say that even death could not end the Qin dynasty. It was built as a fortress, not against armies or grave robbers, but against time itself. And in a genuinely remarkable way, it has worked. 2,200 years after it was sealed, the tomb remains unbreached. Armies have passed over it. Dynasties have risen and fallen above it. The Han dynasty, which replaced the Qin, came and went. The Tang dynasty came and went. The Song, the Yuan, the Ming, the Qing, all of them came and went. The British Empire came and went. 2 world wars happened above it. The Communist Revolution swept through China above it. And still, in the earth, sealed and silent, the Emperor's chamber waits, untouched, unexplored, intact. The outer discoveries, meanwhile, continue to yield information that makes the central mystery even more compelling. In 2024 alone, research teams excavated a total of 75 ancient tombs in 4 kiln sites in eastern China's Anhui province, adding layers to the broader understanding of burial practices across Chinese history. Remote sensing technologies continue to be refined. Today, excavation teams rely on micro-excavation techniques, climate-controlled enclosures built directly over trenches, consolidants tailored for fragile organics, and a battery of non-invasive surveys, including ground-penetrating radar, magnetometry, and high-resolution 3D mapping. The science is improving. Every year it improves. Every year the gap between what we can observe and what we can safely preserve narrows slightly. Every year, the question of when, not if, but when, the chamber might finally be opened becomes slightly less abstract, but slightly is not enough. Not yet. And the people who understand this site best are the ones who are most insistent on waiting because they understand what a single wrong decision would cost. They have the lessons of history to guide them. The excavation of Troy by Heinrich Schliemann in the 1870s serves as the nightmare scenario, the case study archaeologists cite when they explain why patience is not cowardice. Schliemann's work managed to destroy almost all traces of the very city he had set out to uncover. In his rush to find Homer's Troy, he dug through it. The layers he destroyed in his impatience were irreplaceable. They are gone. They will never come back. And that was a city. This is the most elaborately engineered burial complex in human history, built by a man who specifically designed it to be impenetrable, filled with substances that are toxic, chambers that are fragile, and artifacts that are irreplaceable. The Schliemann mistake, in this context, would not be a historical footnote. It would be an act of civilizational vandalism on a scale never before committed. And so the decision holds. The tomb stays sealed, the sensors keep scanning, the scientists keep refining their tools, and the world keeps waiting. When the time is right, it is possible that scientific advancements could finally delve into the secrets that have been lying here undisturbed for some 2,100 years. But when the time is right is doing an enormous amount of work in that sentence. Because what does right mean? Right for the artifacts? Right for the science? Right for China? Right for the world? These are not the same things. They may never fully align. And the longer the tomb stays sealed, the more it becomes something beyond an archaeological mystery. It becomes a mirror held up to every era that discovers it, reflects its own assumptions back at it, and asks what we value more knowing or preserving. Speed or patience, the thrill of revelation or the discipline of restraint. There is also a layer to this story that almost no mainstream coverage touches, and it has to do with what the opening of this tomb would mean not just scientifically, but symbolically, for China's place in the 21st century world. The mausoleum of Qin Shi Huang is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It is one of the most visited archaeological attractions on the planet. Millions of tourists go to Shanxi province every year to stand in front of the terracotta warriors and try to absorb the scale of what they are seeing. The Chinese government has invested substantially in the infrastructure around this site. It is, in the truest sense, a national treasure. Not just culturally, but economically, diplomatically, and symbolically. An unopened central chamber is, paradoxically, more powerful than an opened one because it contains infinite possibility. An open chamber contains only what is actually there, which, no matter how extraordinary, will always be finite. The mystery is worth something. The sealed door is worth something. And the government that controls it knows this. There is a reason that when new scanning results come in, when new data is published, the findings are released carefully, incrementally, with measured academic language and no photographs of the central mound's interior. The information is real. The science is real. But the communication is managed, and that management is deliberate. Because the story of this tomb in the hands of the Chinese state is not just a scientific story. It is a story about the depth and the continuity and the unbroken power of Chinese civilization, and that story is most potent when it remains slightly beyond reach, slightly unresolved, slightly waiting to be fully told. And yet underneath all of that, underneath the politics and the diplomacy and the institutional caution and the scientific methodology, there is something simpler and more human at the heart of this story. There is a dead man. A man who was terrified of dying. A man who spent his entire reign trying to become immortal and failed, and then spent 38 years trying to build an afterlife so overwhelming that death itself would seem like a lesser power. A man who was poisoned by his own medicine, who died alone, whose empire collapsed within 4 years of his death, whose sons and generals and carefully constructed power structures crumbled the moment he was gone. A man who, despite everything, despite the mercury and the crossbows and the 700,000 workers and the 60 square kilometers of engineered afterlife, did not achieve immortality through any of those things. He achieved it through something he did not plan for. He achieved it through the fact that in 2025, 2,200 years after his death, the entire world is still talking about him. That is the strange mercy of history. It remembers you in ways you never intended. It preserves you in forms you could not predict. Qin Shi Huang wanted to be remembered as a god, as an eternal emperor, as a being beyond the reach of time. He is remembered instead as a human being, brilliant, terrifying, driven, afraid, whose tomb we are still too careful, too wise, or perhaps simply too in awe to open. The chamber is still down there. The mercury still flows. The sensors still send their pulses into the earth and receive back data that scientists study in quiet offices and publish in careful academic language. The warriors still stand in their underground formation, still guarding a perimeter, still doing the job they were built to do. And somewhere at the center of all of it, behind walls that have not been touched in over 2 millennia, in darkness that has not been interrupted since before the Roman Empire existed, the first emperor of China waits. When will we finally open it? When will the technology be good enough, the politics be aligned enough, the science be confident enough? When will we know enough to know that we can look without destroying what we see? Nobody knows. And perhaps more unsettling than that, nobody's entirely sure they want to find out. Because some doors, once opened, change the people who opened them. Some silences, once broken, reveal things that rewrite everything that came before. And some tombs, some ancient sealed places in the earth, are more powerful closed than they could ever be open. What is inside that chamber? What do the mercury rivers reflect? What is written on the documents that have been sitting in sealed darkness for 2,000 years? What does the face of Qin Shi Huang's coffin look like? What did the men who sealed themselves inside that room to keep his secrets feel in their final moments? These are the questions that remain. These are the questions that the sealed door holds. And as long as it stays sealed, they remain unanswered, which means they remain alive. And questions that remain alive are, in their own way, immortal, which is perhaps exactly what the emperor intended all along.